Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us in this session on diversity, equity, inclusion. My name is Nadia Singh, and I will be chairing this session. Before we get started, I want to be the first to acknowledge that I was a little bit cranky about the transition from in-person to online, and I am delighted to admit how wrong I was at being cranky, and I want to acknowledge the extremely hard work of everyone at GSA for making this happen. Without their leadership, we wouldn't be here. And I also want to acknowledge how responsive the GSA community has been here. This meeting wouldn't be happening without each and every one of you. So thank you very much. I'd like to give a particular shout out to Tracy DePellegrin and Sarah Bay for making this session happen, as well as Susie Brown and all of the members of the GSA Committee on Equity and Inclusion, chaired by our fearless leader, Noah Whiteman. And I'm really excited to be able to have this opportunity to present some really incredible work on diversity, equity, inclusion from our speakers today. So our first speaker is Scott Barolo, and he is going to be talking about inclusive PhD admissions. Scott?
Hello, hi everybody. I'm honored to be included in this group of speakers, and I will share my screen now. I'm going to be talking about some efforts for inclusive. Can everybody see the screen?
Yes, we can see your slides.
It looks a little different to me. Okay, thank you. I'm going to be talking about some efforts for inclusive PhD admissions that have been happening in my program over the last couple of years, and leading into a new thing that we're trying that I would really like to get feedback on. So first, I will just give you a quick overview of our PhD program and how it works. I'll talk about some of the things we've been doing in the last couple of years, especially with the GRE debates, which we were heavily involved in. And that leads into kind of raise some questions that frame what we're trying to do now and going forward. So I'll get started. So I am the director of a program called PIBS, the Program in Biomedical Sciences, which is an umbrella PhD program housed in the medical school at the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor, Michigan. And our umbrella includes 14 PhD granting programs, some of which are interdepartmental programs, some of which are based in departments. Some are big, some are small, some have a broad scope, some have a narrow scope. They're all quite different. They're all life sciences PhD programs. And here are some numbers just to give you an idea of what we're dealing with in PhD admissions. I wanted to run some numbers by you. So the program's been around for over 20 years. We have over 500 mentor faculty. Most of those are not actively mentoring students at this time, but they're all available to do so. We try to bring in around 90 PhD students every year, although that is not the only source of PhD students for our labs. And students come in through the PIBS umbrella are supported by PIBS for 10 months, where they take classes in that first year and they do 3 to 5 research rotations that are supported by PIBS. And then at a certain point, they transition into their PhD granting lab and a PhD granting program. As I said, there are 14 of those programs. So one of the choices that our students have to make at the end of the first year is which program they're going to join. In terms of some of the admissions numbers, for the current admission season that is just wrapping up, we got almost 1,400 applications. We invited about 22% of those domestic applicants to be interviewed on campus, also some international students, but most of our international students, the ones that are not in country, are interviewed by Skype. Of those 1,400 applications, 18% this past year received offers of admissions in January or February, and the acceptance rate on those offers, I don't know whether these are good numbers or not, but I don't mind sharing them with you. We got 41% take rate last year, and this year it was up significantly after the lockdown. I'm sure some of you have seen the same thing, those of you that are involved in admissions. After the lockdown, we saw a big jump in acceptance of our offers. So we have an unusually big class this year. of around 102. But unfortunately, I think a number of those students are going to have to defer, especially international students who may not get access to enter the country and get a visa in time for the fall. That's a different discussion. So those are the numbers. And I started as director of this program in 2015. And I was interested in exploring how we could improve, what was the state of inclusion in our admissions process and in our PhD programs as a whole, and how could we improve them. It was a particularly good time around then to be thinking about inclusive admissions, especially with regard to the GRE, which I need to talk about for a couple of minutes to lead into the new stuff that we're doing. For us, the GRE debate is really over, but I need to go through the process that we went through here at Michigan because it raised some interesting questions, I think. So at that time, it was a good time to be reconsidering the GRE because some of the institutional barriers to dropping that, or at least to re-examining the value of that exam as an admissions tool had been lowered. Those barriers had been dropped. So for example, NIH and NSF had stopped requiring GRE scores for example, individual fellowships and competitive renewal of P32 training grants, which meant that we didn't technically need GRE scores from our students. And our graduate school here at U of M had dropped that the GRE requirement too, although none of our PhD programs had dropped it by that time, but we were at least allowed to. So very quickly, I want to go through the process that we did here at Michigan, especially in the summer of 2017. I started engaging our faculty with a discussion about the value and the potential problems of the GRE as an admissions tool, and I found out that almost all of our faculty had strong opinions about the GRE one way or the other, but almost none of us had actually read any of the literature. And another reason it was a good time to be talking about this now is that there was a spate of new scholarly research on both the biases and the utility of the GRE that had come out, but very few of us had read those new papers. So I collected and shared that new and old GRE literature with our whole PIBS training community. I got volunteers of faculty who formed a pro-GRE team and an anti-GRE team. Those teams did some research and wrote white papers, which he distributed to everybody, arguing for or against the use of the GRE with references and figures. And then we made sure that that was available for everyone in our community to read. We then had a town hall debate, which we live streamed and tried to include everybody in that discussion with short presentations from both teams as well as a Q&A with students. After a thorough discussion of this issue, during this time, in the summer of 2017, I was involved in expanding this debate to academic Twitter, which is a great place to talk about these issues, if a little chaotic. One of our faculty members, Kate Barolo, jokingly used the term Brexit to discuss this debate, and I started it as a hashtag on Twitter, which really became the symbol for this discussion and movement in the following couple of years. There were many of us on Twitter and other platforms talking about this and getting inputs from all quarters. And the result of all this is that I made a decision for my program based on the white papers and other input to drop the requirement starting the following year. And around that time and shortly thereafter, and for the next couple of years, many other programs did the same. And in the end, I'm just showing a link here to our policy statement, which links to all of the resources that I just told you that we had shared. There are links to everything. But here are the three basic arguments that convinced me that we should drop this requirement. And within the last couple of years, there are around 300 life sciences PhD programs that have made that same decision, and there's a link to an updated list. Josh Hall keeps a list of those programs here. So I don't want to spend too much time on that, but that's the process that we went through. Basically, so as a result of these changes that we made in 2018, we stopped requiring the GRE for graduate admissions. What was the impact on our program? Well, if you look at the racial ethnic diversity of our applicant pool and our incoming class, this is from 1999 to 2019, the percentage of underrepresented minorities as defined by NIH. So that's a very limited criterion, but that's at least a stable one that we can use as a rough estimate of racial diversity. This is the URM percentage in our domestic applications, and the black line is the URM percentage of the domestic students in our final pitch class for every year. So what is a fair comparison? What is a good number? I think that the simplest, most basic comparison you can make is to compare these two numbers, the applicant pool versus your final pool of enrolled students, and see if there's a big discrepancy. We see that there's not a big discrepancy, so we're not losing a lot of, overall, we're not losing a lot of minoritized students during the admissions process. Are these good numbers? That is a valid question. We do not know. I also took a look at gender. So roughly speaking, the gender breakdown for our final pitch class is always very similar to the applicant pool. I've also included the gender breakdown for our faculty, and you can see there's a big discrepancy there. There's also, of course, a big discrepancy in racial ethnic diversity for faculty versus students, which is something that I always try to bring up in these discussions. It's really difficult to try to talk about solutions for diversity in the trainee pool if we're not going to address the major systemic problems we have with lack of diversity in the faculty pool. But perhaps that's a different discussion. What I've showed you are overall numbers for our whole umbrella. But I wanted to take a look at, if you look at our individual programs, are there differences? Are there things we can learn, things we can do better? What I'm showing here is a different way to break down the data. This is the underrepresented minority percentage of our domestic pool, broken down by the total applicant pool over on the left, then the students that we invited for interviews, the students who received offers of admission from us, and then finally on the right, the domestic students that enrolled in PIBS. So you can see that the numbers are fairly flat for PIBS as a whole. The dots are for each of our individual 14 programs, and if you look at each one, I'm not going to show you the names of those programs, but we have very different outcomes, both at the start and the beginning of the process for individual programs. So I think there's a lot to learn here, and very quickly, we can see that there are some programs who start off well and manage to do even better during the admissions process. This group tends to contain most of our programs that have NIH T32 training grants, I'll mention. A group in the middle, and then what's maybe more interesting are those who show a drop-off. So for example, the yellow program here, there's a big drop-off in the number of students invited, whereas for the orange program, there's a big drop-off between the offers that are made, and basically what they're seeing is that minoritized students are not accepting their offers. So these different shapes of the slope, I think, suggest different possible solutions, and so we're trying to work on that. So that was the debate, and one big question that came out of the GRE the GRE debate and the subsequent kind of analysis is, well, if you're dropping the GRE, that's great, congratulations, you're dropping a biased metric, but what are you going to rely on for admissions? Where are the unbiased metrics you can use for admissions? Is it going to be GPA? Is it going to be amount of research experience, letters of recommendation? Because the truth is, each of those are subject to bias and inequities, and that is a really valid criticism of the idea of simply dropping the GRE and then saying, great, we're fair now. We really can't do that. So inspired by what I think was the success in our GRE debate and the outcomes of that, we really try to we'd like to try to expand that process where we as a faculty and students together engage with the issues of equitable and inclusive admissions and try to come up with solutions for ourselves. Simply imposing a national solution or national conclusions on our faculty doesn't seem to be very effective. We like to come up with our own answers, even if it end up being the same as everybody else's. So earlier this year, I formed a PIBS Inclusive Admissions Committee, and I'll briefly break down what we're trying to accomplish, but we're just at the beginning of this process. We're going to look at every aspect of admissions, not just the application form itself, but the entire process from beginning to end. Examine them, look at the literature, as well as kind of outstanding opinions on each of those aspects of the admissions process, and then try to write a fairly short, I'm afraid it won't be that short, evidence-based guide for inclusive admissions for our faculty. Perhaps we can adapt a version of this for our students and prospective students as well. I think that might be useful. But together we're going to do that. This is a group of, I should mention, faculty, staff, and students, all working together. And finally, after the guide has been written, I would like this committee to make recommendations to me as the PIBS director for how can we change the process for the better. So I don't have any products from this. Hopefully this is a committee that will continue to exist going forward, track our improvements, and make suggestions. And in the
Scott,
final...
Sorry, I'm gonna actually have
time?
to cut you off. We're at time. Yes, thank you so much for your
Okay,
presentation.
great. These are the topics that we're looking at, and this is really the last slide I wanted to show you. So as you can see, we're taking a deep dive, and I can't wait to see what this group comes up with. And with that, I will stop. Thank you very much. Thank
you very much. That was a fantastic talk, and there are some really incredible questions in the question and answer that you will be sent later, and hopefully you can answer them. Our next speaker is Andrea Darby, and she's going to be talking about a diversity preview weekend. Andrea, thank you for being here. Please share your slides, and I'll let you know when we can see them. All right, we can see your slides. Take it away. Thank you.
Should probably unmute myself. All right, so thank you, Nadia, and thank you to the organizers for putting on this event. I'm excited to share with you about this weekend that I'm currently a co-leader or organizer of, and I was also a former participant of when I was a college undergraduate senior. So let's get right to it. All right, so no surprise to this audience here, but one major problem that we have is addressing this problem of few underrepresented minority students being admitted to departments across the United States, but also to the Department of Ecology and Evolutionary Biology at Cornell. Pictured here is Suzanne Pierre, who is a former PhD student in EEB at Cornell. And she wanted to understand why we're seeing this basically exclusive white cohorts, despite Cornell's push for being more diverse and inclusive. So looking into these trends, she saw that in addition to having few URMs being admitted, that there are very few even applying. So here, this graph is a breakdown from 2009 and 2016 of EEB applicants. You can see this great bias of white applicants and even more international applicants to this program compared to racial domestic minorities. And one of the potential underlying causes for seeing this is that there could be lack of resources to assist with applying that URMs may not have at their institutions, as well as that these types of students may not even see themselves at an institution like Cornell or even be considered. So Suzanne, in coalition with other graduate students at Cornell EEB, such as Kate McDonald and even other postdocs, came up with a solution to this problem of few URM applicants by having a pre-recruitment event. So with this event, we would bring in URM students to preview graduate school at Cornell. And we do this by addressing physical barriers to applying, such as giving them resources and guidances, as well as dismantling mental barriers to pursuing graduate education by empowering our participants to demystify these thoughts that they may have when applying to schools like Cornell. And with this initiative in its first iteration of 2017, it is a grad student-led initiative by those in EEB, entomology, which I am currently in, and the School of Integrative Plant Sciences. And just to note that this is an event that is planned and organized from reviewing applications to putting on workshops for this event by grad students in this department. So here I'll share an overview of a little bit of what the logistics are. So we have a weekend where we bring in participants to experience our workshops and a lot of networking opportunities. And we try to target those who are junior level undergraduate students, typically those before they would apply to grad school. So we wouldn't target like first or sophomores, for example. And we don't just advertise this across the New York region, but also across the United States and even US territories like Puerto Rico and Guam. And we advertise it at minority serving institutions, as well as conferences. Like when I was an undergrad, I found out about this event at the annual Biomedical Research Conference for minority students that are known as ABRCAMS. And for this event, we accept approximately 40 students per year, and we do this based off of 3 criteria. So need, kind of assessing what kind of resources do they have access to, merit, do they have a demonstrated commitment to their academics or have research experience, as well as a research fit. So do their interests align with the 3 fields that are involved in this event? So if there was a psychology student who wanted to preview, they wouldn't be able to do this kind of event. And all expenses are paid for all of our participants that come, which includes flights, lodges, and meals. And it costs us about $1,200 per student to bring. And I just like to shout out Tara Reed here. She helps us as an admin assistant when it comes to getting all these kind of logistics planned out. So getting into the kind of demographics that we serve. So we serve all kinds of walks of life with our program, from racial minorities, which you can see represented in the circle here from year 2017 to 2019, where we have over 83% of racial minorities participating, as well as those that come from other groups that are not as represented in higher education, such as first generation college students, where over half of our participants are, as well as those that are from low income groups, the LGBTQ plus community, and those of various disability statuses. And with here, these statistics represent to us just that we are reaching the groups that we want to reach out to, but as well as that we are traversing multiple levels of diverse backgrounds. So getting into what the actual weekend looks like. So we have 4 days of workshops, networking, and learning that our participants get to involve themselves with, and I like to highlight a few of them. So one of the first things they'll do is a grad school one-on-one workshop where they get to learn about, well, what grad school is like, but also what are the components of an application? How do you navigate it? Like, when do you contact letter writers or contact potential advisors? Additionally, they'll get to participate in this how to interview workshop where they get to craft their own elevator pitch that you would use when you are interviewing at grad school programs. And they get to actually test out those skills that they learn on mock faculty interviews, where they get to, it's like grad school interviews where they get to meet with faculty who they have overlapping interests with. And a fun fact for me is that when I was a participant, during my mock faculty interviews, I actually interviewed with a faculty who is now my current advisor at Cornell. Additionally, of course, we'll do a tour of the campus and departmental facilities that these students would have access to if they were students here. And we have very interactive workshops where students submit a draft of a personal statement and a CV, and they work with peer review workshops, peer review groups, and also get to learn about national fellowships they can apply for, such as the GRFP or the Ford Foundation Predoctoral Fellowship. And lastly, some things I'd like to share is with workshops, there's also a lot of networking and learning that goes on. So we have research fairs and student life talks where our participants get to learn about the research going on at Cornell, but also what life is like for graduate students in our communities. And one important thing I want to highlight of this event is that we are celebrating diversity and inclusion, and we provide a safe space for all of us to talk about how our cultural and ethnic identities impact us as students in STEM. So even when the weekend ends, that doesn't mean the programming does. So one thing that we provide our participants once they come home is a mentorship program where participants are paired with a grad student mentor, typically based off of similar research interests. And when time comes for when they want to apply to grad schools, their mentor can help assist them with applications. In addition to that, if our participants apply to Cornell, they get further assistance from the Director of Grad School Recruitment, Anitra Douglas, who provides further assistance when applying to Cornell. And all of our participants get applications fees waived when they do apply to our Cornell programs. And given that we have a lot of great programming that we offer our participants, we want to assess what kind of impact our weekend truly has. So we give them surveys before and after the weekend to get an idea of what kind of attitude or beliefs that they have about their skills in succeeding in graduate school. So with this survey here, from strongly disagree to strongly agree, we asked them, do they believe they have the skills to succeed in grad school? And with this pre-DPW event results, I'll share the after. And you can see this obvious shift from more neutral or even negative views of their skills in succeeding to more positive attitudes. And additionally, we collect quotes from our attendees on their experience, and here I'd like to highlight a few. So the first one being just being able to meet diverse students from all backgrounds that were interested in ecology was awesome. The energy was amazing, and coming from such a prestigious school like Cornell was the cherry on top. For this participant, they said that I received an NSF GRFP this year, and I 100% would not have without the connections I made. And lastly, this participant said that I'll be applying to Cornell for grad school, which I hadn't considered before. And these survey results and quotes like this are very powerful to me because it really shows the impact that we are addressing not just physical barriers of not having resources to apply to these schools, but also addressing mental barriers that students have to applying to schools and programs such as ours. So to get into a bit about our success from 2017 and 2018, we've had 62 attendees. And of those who have responded to our surveys, 43 have given us updates of where they are. And of those 43, 29 have matriculated into graduate degree programs. Some of them here you can see in this bubble are still undergraduates, and we're hoping to hear from them soon about where they have gone. And of these 29 who matriculated, 8 of them are here at Cornell, and which speaks to us just how successful our program is, even though it's been around for 3 years, that we are reaching these students, having them come visit us and not just check us out, but also applying and coming. And it's also still a success to us if our participants are still moving on to these other institutions. So I'd like to highlight our funding sources, and I really do want to emphasize that this is a student-led initiative that costs approximately $1,200 per participant. And our grad students who help put on this event work very hard and have creative ways of acquiring resources from all across campus, as well as from private industries such as Corn Teva Agriscience. And as I'm coming to a close to my talk, I want to show you guys a picture of myself when I was an undergrad at this event. And I really highly encourage your students to apply or to even start your own. Because with universities wanting to be more diverse and inclusive, what are some actionable ways that they can do this? And by having a preview event, such as this one, we can make efforts to making contributions to STEM being more accessible and equitable. Such as, like for me, like before this event, I never saw myself at a place like Cornell. And after going there, I am here now talking to you guys about this event, which I think is very powerful. With that, I'd just like to acknowledge our DPW 2020 co-leaders. Hopefully we get to host it this fall, fingers crossed, and those who helped us along the way. And you can check us out on social media, as well as our website, cornelldpw.org. With that, thank you for listening, and I'm really ready to take questions.
Awesome, thank you so much, Andrea. We have a couple of questions from our audience. One question is from Wynn Meyer, who asks, how did you get the leadership buy-in for your diversity preview weekend? And what is the level of support and engagement by non-URM grad students and faculty?
So Suzanne And other grad students wrote a letter to faculty in the department of EEB, and they collected this data from, like the data I showed you in my first graph of those applicants. They drafted a letter to the faculty showing stats on this data and giving them a presentation. And that's how we were able to get EEB faculty in on it, and as well as engagement of non-URM grad students and faculty. Well, basically the whole department of, majority of the faculty and grad students are non-URM, and we have a high participation of them, or else we wouldn't have this kind of event.
Fantastic, thank you. We have another question from Jamie Lavick, who asks, is there any part of this event that is focused on surviving grad school or unwritten rules of succeeding in grad school rather than understanding the application process?
Yeah, so we do have components of that. I didn't highlight that here, but we do have conversations where we talk about, say like mental health that does come. And we have created a new workshop where we kind of have a assessment of, is grad school right for me? That we have for our participants to indulge in.
Wonderful, thank you. That's all the questions we have. Thank you for a wonderful talk.
Thank you.
Yeah. Our next speaker is Gary McDowell, and he's going to be talking about bridging worlds for diversity and inclusion. Gary, welcome. I'll let you know when and we've got your slides up. Thank you.
Great, thank you. I want to thank GSA for the opportunity to present this. And particularly, I really want to acknowledge that GSA was great at keeping everyone informed as to what was going on, and you know, helping us sort of plan for everything as the situation developed, and giving lots of guarantees and so on. So I really want to acknowledge and appreciate GSA for that. I want to thank Dr. Singh for chairing this session and herding virtual cats. I know I've been a bit of a troublemaker myself, so I apologize for that. I was hoping to have all three of us on here, myself, Dr. Andrea Cobb from George Mason University, and Dr. Jessica Reagan-Lewis from Southern Illinois University, Carbondale. They're unable to join, I think, so they've sent some notes across. And I will try to communicate their thoughts to you too. So I'm going to actually step back from the graduate perspective and now talk a bit more about undergraduate and introduce the inclusive environments and metrics in biology, education and research, or iEMBER Network. Talk about what it is, what we do, and how you may wish to get involved. All right, so what is iEMBER? The iEMBER Network brings together educators, researchers, administrators, and others from a range of fields who share an interest in biology, education, research. For example, we have members from fields such as education, biology, chemistry, biochemistry, psychology, sociology, and anthropology. The iEMBER Network has been created to address diversity, equity, inclusion, and social justice, and drive reform efforts in biology education from a multidisciplinary sociological perspective, by providing opportunities to participate and collaborate. So what's the problem that we are trying to solve? Well, it's essentially this that you can see here. The US population and workforce are becoming increasingly diverse, yet this increase in diversity is not reflected in the current composition of the STEM workforce, with only about 10% of STEM-based jobs held by individuals from minoritized groups. Diverse perspectives are essential in STEM, and the current underrepresentation of minoritized groups in STEM negatively impacts technological innovation. Simply put, science that is more inclusive is better. But aside from that, who is included and supported in STEM is an issue of social justice. A person's participation in STEM can impact the entire trajectory of their life. Gatekeeping, therefore, can affect the level at which people from different groups participate in research and society, economically, politically, and culturally. Broadening participation in STEM at all career and education levels is therefore necessary. So to close this gap in the workforce, retention in undergraduate STEM majors is an area that arguably does not receive enough attention. Along with the transition of postdocs into faculty positions, It is one of two major checkpoints to address in diversifying biomedical faculty in particular, which is discussed in the Myers et al. Paper that I have shown a link to here. So therefore, iEMBER is working to address the sociological factors that affect retention in undergraduate STEM majors. And a number of these are identified in the NSF 2011 Vision and Change, a call to action report, which we've used as a framework for some of our actions. And we are working to do this using a multidisciplinary collaborative approach. So what do we actually do? So our community of practice framework allows stakeholders to build relationships and share resources across institution types. And we actively embrace early career researchers in this work. I will actually point out that when the network started, I was in from the beginning, and I was a co-PI as a postdoc on an MSF incubator grant. So we really actively think about including grad students, postdocs, who are developing their own interests and research projects in this field in this. The iEMBER group examines new ways of thinking about STEM higher education reform, taking the view of education spaces as social interaction spaces. So we're a new organization as of 2017, and we began to populate our network and facilitate the creation of research ideas using a startup style pitching session framework at our events. So essentially what we do in these sessions is we put participants into randomly assigned groups, and they develop an initial idea based on their various expertises or thoughts or problems that have occurred to them throughout what we've discussed before in the session. So they report out briefly some of these ideas of potential research projects or collaborations out to the entire room. People will then self-select and rearrange into groups to then continue discussions and work further on the problems that are of interest to them that either their group or other groups have come up with. And then they report out again and tell the entire room what they think. And the goal here is to try and start getting people talking, start getting people to think together, and maybe come up with some unique projects and things to think of. And we have some pots of money to give little starter awards for pilot work as well. So where have we done this? We've held two conferences, our inaugural conference in 2017 and then one last year, both at Harris-Stowe State University in St. Louis. And next year, we are hoping to have a meeting at Montana State University in Billings. And we've also held events like this at various discipline-specific conferences. And as you can see, across a range of disciplines from cell biology to psychology to education. So what do these events result in? So projects have resulted in manuscripts, new IRB approved collaborative research projects, and formal and informal sessions at national conferences. So I'm going to discuss briefly some examples of projects. I'm afraid I don't actually work on these projects myself. And the last one, Andrea was hoping to come in and talk to you about herself. So I hope I don't do a disservice in trying to communicate to you what they're doing. So the Work School Conflict Experienced by Non-Traditional Students project plans to look at whether coping behaviors which influence inclusivity at work relate to inclusivity at school for non-traditional students. And there's a number of categories that they're using to define non-traditional students, which include being single parent, full-time worker, part-time student, and students over the age of 24 as undergraduates. The prediction is that the development of adaptive behaviors will lead to greater feelings of inclusivity for biology majors, with sort of feedback between their work experience and their school experience. This plans to be a longitudinal study. The next project here, piloting a study of promoting student self-identification as scientists. So this project hypothesizes that open-ended questions that can frame students in the role of a scientist will promote student identity as a scientist. And this is essentially asking particularly undergrads a series of questions in a questionnaire format. And it's being developed with a framing for undergraduates, but interestingly, some of the preliminary work has identified that this lack of self-identity as a scientist is not only occurring in undergraduates, but also grad students and postdocs. And this maybe doesn't surprise you, but it's been interesting to hear that they found that. And then the STEM toolkit, or a toolkit for STEM diversity learning communities. So Andrea has sent across some notes for me. They're planning to create a curated website with links, discussion boards, and virtual chats to join for those with diverse expertise and views, such as social scientists, STEM researchers, educators, administrators, funding specialists, and evaluation experts, the sort of people already involved, or we hope to get more involved in the iEMBER network, and to bring them together to share best practices to broaden diversity in STEM. So the project is trying to address questions such as, what is a learning community? What does the data show about learning communities as a high impact practice? How do you construct one? Formulate smarter goals around that, and collect and analyze data through such a community to answer some of the questions that they are posing. So thinking about this toolkit and thinking about an approach to a program or an institution or a department trying to increase diversity. They're thinking about providing framework for helping you assess the current state of your institution or your department or group with respect to participation, the attitudes and interactions of the people that you serve and the surrounding community. Using identity in the needs of diverse stakeholders to broaden involvement and increase impact, and using data sets to analyze relationships between your departmental or institutional assessment of their situation and the feedback from the students you're looking to support, which is incredibly important because there's quite often a disconnect between those at the administrative or leadership level and those in the sort of student body. And they'll also be thinking about how you can invite stakeholders to form, for example, advisory boards, conducting meetings for improving productivity and greatest impact, training faculties, mentors, and staff in more inclusive practices. And basically, this is a way of collating and sharing resources and best practices amongst these groups. And they're also looking to think about how to increase psychosocial factors for a diverse body of students, such as a sense of belonging through service and social activities, family participation and support, and financial support, and links to psychological support services for students. So that's an example of some of the things we're thinking about. So why are we involved? So I was hoping that, with all three of us here, Jessica is an educator, Andrea is administrator, and myself, you'd be able to hear some of the perspectives. Andrea has sent across why she joined EMBER, iEMBER relatively recently. So the new administrator at a university with fewer underrepresented STEM research students than we'd like, I needed to find a network of expertise to increase our STEM diversity. I didn't have the understanding and frame of reference at that time. My iEMBER colleagues asked me important questions and suggested articles and topics for me to consider, which helped me develop my capacity to impact diverse students. Without help from my iEMBER friends, I would never have been able to continue to a great framework we used for our NIH T32 grant proposal last May. And speaking for myself, I've done a lot of work and thinking about the people in the system, and that's really what drives me. I've focused a lot on the postdoc end of the early career researcher spectrum. But really, a lot of the things that need to happen at the time of the postdoc, it sort of can sometimes be a bit late to try and intervene at that point. And so it's been really interesting to learn about the undergraduate space and to try and help. My role in the group is developing sustainability and support and bigger picture thoughts about the network itself. And so it's been really interesting and engaging to learn about that and work with these folks. So if you're interested in learning more, we have this website here, iember.cubeshub.org. We have a forum on Cubes Hub. You can go to this link and then there's a tab for how to join and you can find out more. With that, I will take any questions. I just want to thank GSA for having me here and the NSF for supporting us with our incubator grant and now the full grant that we have. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Gary, for that interesting talk. We don't have any questions from the audience at this moment, but I do have one question about whether you've done any assessments on or surveys from the participants on and whether you're evaluating outcomes in any way.
Yes. For the grant that we have now, we have an external evaluator. We have done a little bit of feedback and we actually, it's a pity it hadn't come out just yet. We have a paper about our conferences and talks about the feedback that people have given from that. It is literally about to come out. The proofs are being dealt with. It's for a special issue in Journal of Molecular Biology Education, and some of those papers have already come out. So there's more of that in there. But yeah, we're definitely thinking about the network itself. Yeah.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. And thank you again for that really interesting talk. We're going to move on to our next speaker. Our next speaker is Jennifer Alexander, and she will be talking about the inclusion of dietary practices in genetics research. Jennifer? I can see your slides. Thank you.
Yes. Thank you all so much. So today, first of all, my name is Jennifer Alexander, and I'm really excited to be a part of a panel that are all committed to addressing, diversity aspects. And so I'm here today to, especially at the undergraduate and graduate level, but today I'm here to talk about a program, and not just talk about a program, but show you a program where we've implemented our different areas in early on in high school and middle school students to try to address diversity. And so what we've done in our program, thank you. So what we've done in our program is combine both cultural and dietary practices with genetic research to not just address health disparities, but as well diversify the scientific workforce. And so how we've accomplished this is through a program in which I plan to show you. But before I get too much into the program, I first want to take a second to establish our baseline for what we mean by health disparities. So health disparities are comprised of really two essential themes, one being health experiences, as well as the healthcare that's provided to a specific group of people that there's often seen an imbalance in these two aspects. And now when we narrow this down to cancer health disparities and what the problems are that arise there, it's really highlighted as a lack of access and quality of care. Now you might ask, well, how do we, with all the advances and as much as we know, how could this still be an issue? And it's simply because we really have a narrow subject field. And what I mean is that it's known that minorities or underrepresented groups are not predominant in a lot of our clinical trials and studies, as well as our basic research directions. In addition to that, there's this idea about cultural competency, where we're not exposed enough to the dynamics of culture, or in some aspects are not appreciated or considered. And as a result of it, it creates this environment of mistrust where the populations that we are intending to help don't actually trust the people in place to help them. And so we've identified, because of these and the many other factors, that the problem specifically with this limited study field and cultural competency is really a lack of diversity in the workforce, both in biomedical research as well as amongst clinical professionals. And so as a result of identifying this as a problem, we know it to be a problem more so, that it limits our ability to solve complex problems. And it also hinders on our innovation, both nationally as well as globally. And so in identifying the importance and the problem, a lot of people have thrown their hat into the ring of how can we best tackle diversity. However, we believe that these efforts are really doing it the wrong way. And I'll explain what I mean. When we talk about diversity goals, we typically have a list of demographics in which more so become check marks off of a list of satisfied outcomes. And we have this assumption that with these diversity or different demographics, that this should generate a diversity in ideas. However, this is just an assumption. In fact, what we're proposing is that you not just consider what people look like and be satisfied that you have a mixed view in terms of what people look like, but also in their ideas in the way they perceive problems, as well as attempt to solve problems, as well as the experiences they bring in their own environment to help us get a better understanding. And so where did we go wrong? Well, we have to both look to the education system as both the problem and the solution. And from a problem standpoint, we know that we have students with not only diverse backgrounds in terms of ethnicity and age, but we also have a diversity in educational, outcomes in terms of how students learn and how students can perceive and retain and view information. And we take all of these differences and we funnel them through the education system that's focused on success in standardized exams. And what that does is through this, you strip off all of these unique markers and make a uniform person and ideas and thoughts and perspectives. And so because we recognize that this is the problem, we also see it as a solution. And the solution being that instead, how about we pour into the education system more resources, innovation, more of all of our experiences. And with that, we can now change those outcomes to reverse the problem. And so how and what do we pour into this system? Well, right now, we see that a lot of initiatives or current strategies are focused at just exposing diverse populations to STEM education, STEM opportunities. Some even have the mindset of going in to save students from failure through this efforts. But our approach is very different. Instead, what we desire is to first instill into our students that they matter and that they're important, not only just their where they're from, but also their ideas, their experiences, specifically dealing with cancer and how they can make an impact on changing these outcomes. And we do so by inspiring their potential as well as their abilities. And we charge them to take both their potential and abilities as a duty now to make change in their own communities. And so overall, what we're doing, as opposed to coming in with our capes to save communities and students and these populations, instead we are equipping these students with their own capes and their own tools to go and save their population and communities. And so how do we exactly do this? Well, our aim is really simple. We first start out as a baseline with engaging the students with scientific literature. And we challenge the students to go into the literature and highlight cancer-causing foods that has been cited throughout literature, and then also look at anti-cancer-causing foods that's also cited in literature. And to take their literary findings and now go to their homes and speak to their families about what are their cultural practices and the foods that they eat to cure or help with a lot of the symptoms that they experience in their specific cultures. And when they come back to us with this list of, wow, these are what I've learned, we now take them into basic signal transduction processes and help them to understand that all of this ends with a number of different outcomes that affect on lifespan and reproduction and growth and development. And so we then mirror these two by now telling them, or teaching them rather, that these foods break down into active compounds, and those active compounds serve as either ligands or even effectors that are driving these processes. And so this becomes really powerful for our students in a number of ways. One, they now take all of these active compounds or these nutrient supplements, and they couple it with their understanding of what we teach them about oncogenes and tumor suppressors, and they try to now identify the oncogene and tumor suppressor genes that are culturally relevant to them. And then we take all of their gathered information and now use the Drosophila model where we have Drosophila that bear these oncogenes or mutations in these tumor suppressors. And we look at how feeding them these different nutrients can affect fly development as well as egg production and viability. And so this is really, really powerful because as we understand from the aspect of cancer, that 40% of cancers are preventable. And when you break down these major causative factors with obesity, alcohol consumption, physical inactivity, and poor diet, they really all lump in or related to dietary causes. And so what we're doing is taking our students, and now they are taking a charge and looking at what's going on and identifying or defining rather the underlying mechanism to not only treat, but also help with cancer outcomes for patients, specifically ones that they are near and dear to them. And so far I've talked to you about what we're doing and how and what we've poured in, but exactly how is where I'll focus next. So how we do this is by reinforcing this idea that our students are our future heroes, they are our future leaders. And what our program inputs in students, we also have an expectation for student output that honestly saying the students always exceed our expectations. Now, so what does program input look like? Well, first we have this amazing collaboration between scientists and educators that come together to not only allow the students to experience these this scientific process in our laboratories, but as well in their classroom. And then not only are we focused on the students now coming up with their own problems and exploring diseases that are cancers that are relevant for their culture, but they're also identifying, making observations about how these nutrients are affecting them. And then we, through a platform talk, we allow each of our students to display their findings in their research and experimentation and take ownership of it in their presentation to both the scientific community as well as their families. And lastly, we also try to create a sense of community where there's no competition, failure is not an excuse or an option for our students, and that we really instill in them that they're in it together. And the students work together, not just to help each other get through the program, but through that process, they get this appreciation for these cultural differences that they then champion to continue in the gauntlet. And so then when we talk about output strategies, first of all, our students become advocates, and not just in the science and the projects that they understand, but also in how they can now get this information out to the communities, get more students involved in research and wanting to ask questions. And then our students also seek advancement, where 74% of our graduating seniors actually go on into undergraduate programs as STEM majors. And then lastly, the students come back to support us. And we provide opportunities for them to do that, where they serve on selection committees to further our program. And so again, with the how, it's really simple, where we have a model where we have learn one, do one, teach one, where our students first learn different aspects, and that all that they learn empowers them to now want to do. And in them doing the projects and the presentation, they now have this burning desire to teach all that they've learned. And from teaching what they've learned, it now kind of inspires them to do more. And in doing more, instead of us coming to them with information, they're now coming to us to want to learn more information. And so how has this worked out for us? Well, we realized that we can only cater to a certain amount of students at a time. And so what we rely on or generated is these internal networks where members of the Fox Chase community, which is where we're housed currently, actually open up their labs to the students who have successfully gone through our program. And in fact, the Peterson lab not only took in students, but they followed up on some of the nutrients that were screened through our program that are going to aid in a publication soon to come out regarding bitter melon. In addition to these internal networks, we also have external networks where that not only allow our students to extend beyond the Fox Chase community, but as well it generates collaboration between institutions. And what this has generated in the end is more of our students not only contributing to their research efforts, but also serving on published work, where all of the red circles and squares identify the works that our students have been co-authored on. And so where are we today? Well, this is a picture of our 2019 symposium, where it comprises of both students, old and new, who've come to present their work. And since the inception of the program, we've trained almost 2,000 students, where more than 60% are underrepresented minorities. We've expanded our program sites to include high schools, and the teachers are really involved and excited. And ultimately, we've generated approximately 3,700 experimental data points, where we've linked to 15 cancer genes that are being followed up in pending publications. And so without, none of this is possible, first and foremost, without the co-founders of this program, who Alana O'Reilly and Dara Ruiz Whalen, who have really championed this and really have been strategic in seeking out individuals to help grow it. And we must thank our students, our teachers, our families that continue to pour in and really grow our community. Of course, Fox, Chase, and Jefferson, who have been, continued support of our program, as well as other institutions that have opened their doors to allow us to carry out our program and display our program, and of course, our funding mechanisms. At this time, I thank you all for listening, and I'll take questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jennifer. Really exciting talk. We have one question from an anonymous attendee who asks about how much misinformation do you deal with students coming in from kind of pop science studies, and how do you combat that?
So actually, we love when students come in with the misinformation, because it's really an opportunity now to engage them and get them to think critically about what it is that they're reading. So instead of, when they come to us with this, instead of saying, no, that makes no sense, that's foolish, instead we say, well, what do you think? Let's think about what we've learned about signal transduction. Let's think about what we know about genetics and how it all works together. And instead of us feeding the students the information, the students now look at the information and can evaluate it critically for themselves, so that beyond our program, they're now looking through what they're hearing in social media as well as other media outlets, and being able to disseminate or decipher the information to find the truth.
I love that.
Thank you for that.
Yeah, thank you so much for that answer. So we're at time now. Thank you again, Jennifer. And we are going to turn to our final speaker for this session, and that is Krystal Tsosie, and she will be speaking about building an Indigenous biobank. Krystal? All right, I can see your slides. Take it away.
Hi everyone. Yat esh ekenich ini nishli do nakaidina e bashichin torich ini dashich do tluzalana dashnala Krystal Tsosie nishya. And I am very happy to join you this morning. I am actually, if I can progress my slide, in Arizona at this moment. So if you know me at all, you know that I travel quite a bit. My institution's at Vanderbilt University in Nashville, but I also am a tribal college instructor in Turtle Mountain, where I conduct a lot of my research. But I am actually from the Navajo Nation, which is unfortunately getting quite a bit of news as of recent. And I just want to show you just a little bit about when we talk about health disparities, what exactly are we referring to? Because as a geneticist in training, you know, we like to give the message that precision health and medicine is the way forward. However, we are dealing with real structural barriers to health here. When we're talking about, you know, standards of living that are not current by today's standards, you know, that's such that individuals, this gentleman on the left looks like my uncle, and he and others haul their water from wells, and, you know, to state that we need to wash our hands completely during the coronavirus pandemic, and when there's no water, is kind of an issue. The image on the right is actually, and if I get my left and right mixed up, I'm sorry. But the image on the right is actually my grandmother's house, and you can't really see it, but it used to have these images like that said like flammable on the side, and it's a little one-room house. It's actually heated by coal, and this is 250,000 people here that we're talking about, with a lifespan of 4.5 years less than the national average. This is really key, because when we're talking about differences in rates of health outcomes across the board, American Indians suffer probably worse health outcomes in many of the chronic disease metrics that you can think of. And yet, you know, we also see that less than 1% of genome study participants are Indigenous. However, I do want to stress that genetics is not always the way forward, and there are other implications and questions that must be considered when we're talking about trying to ameliorate health disparities. So I know that a number of you are probably not in the realm of human studies research, but when you're working with human subjects, in this country, we abide by the common rule, which is basically a guideline put forward to establish what is considered equitable and protective practices for working with human subject research. And in 2017, these updates, uphold, but they do not preempt tribal sovereignty. So it's like a way for the federal government to sort of acknowledge that tribes have the ability to self-govern what types of research occur on their communities, that, the academic institutions should abide by. But what exactly does that look like, especially when we're talking about 570 plus federally recognized tribes, each with their own genetics and cultural histories that are distinct, each with their own health status that's unique. And not all of these tribes have their own ways of regulating their own research. Many tribes rely on regional IHS agencies to review their protocols. Some rely on an ethics committee or a tribal council, which have their own logistical limitations. And also, even if a tribe does render a decision on research and what is the best practices for them, do academic institutions and non-native researchers abide by their decisions? So what it used to be historically is that a researcher who's typically non-native would just rely on their own institutions' governance and policies to gain access to tribal participants. What we as Indigenous geneticists would like, and Indigenous researchers would like, is to have researchers actually go through a tribal regulatory process to gain access to, for instance, genomic and other health data collected from tribal participants. However, what we can see happening is that, specifically for somebody who's not familiar with all the different guidelines and rules and institutions outside of the traditional academic environment, a number of individuals may not know what the process is, or who to contact in a tribe, or what the IHS's jurisdiction is, even if it's not in research that is considered human subjects research. And, a researcher can be overwhelmed, which is, we as Indigenous researchers do try to have a framework in which we have put forward principles for guiding equitable research that are grounded in principles of community-based participatory research or community-engaged research at all aspects of research, from the question to the data generation, dissemination, and how it's published. And it's a great publication right there for your reference. But what ends up happening is when you look at the population characteristics of Indigenous peoples just in the US, we realize that a large number of Native American individuals reside off of the reservation. So even though a tribe might be able to place or enforce protections at their tribal community level, there also needs to be considerations for individuals residing outside of tribal communities. And what we see happening is that, largely non-Indigenous researchers may be unfamiliar with community engaged models. Community engagement is relatively new in genetics and precision health and medicine and other fields in biology. It takes time to build those community relationships, and that's not exactly compatible with our publish or perish atmosphere in academia. And also support for training non-Indigenous researchers in community engagement is kind of low. And what we see happening are three things. There are three general paths in which, largely, again, non-Indigenous researchers circumvent tribal review policies. One is to passively recruit Native individuals from large cities with high Native American populations, like Phoenix, Arizona, or Tucson, Arizona, for instance. Targeting Native Americans and their descendants using direct-to-consumer tests such as 23andMe and Ancestry, or just actively pursuing urban individuals with the knowledge that they could recruit Indigenous people and circumvent the tribal regulatory process, which is fascinating to hear what comes out of certain researchers' mouths when they're comfortable in dialogue. So what we actually see happening is that there are still mechanisms, even in today's day and age, where we're talking about community engagement, for a researcher to totally circumvent the tribal review process, to gain access to genomic and health data from tribal participants, which is becoming, that type of data, especially in this economy, is becoming more sensitive. It's becoming more able to, you're able to generate deeper sets of data that not just identify one single individual, but also a group and a community, and that could be used to reinforce negative stereotypes that may already exist in that community. So I bring up All of Us because All of Us is sort of a new project, a new data, a new large-scale diversity project, which is sort of emblematic of all of the questions and problems of previous large-scale diversity projects that have occurred in the past, such as the Human Genome Diversity Project or the Genographic Project, or even 1,000 Genomes, in which in the past, in global Indigenous populations were effectively, researchers would come into remote Indigenous communities, collect blood and other data from Indigenous communities and just leave. And you know, that type of practice was halted by the United Nations, and because of groups, Indigenous groups protesting this sort of unethical abuse in collecting data, you know, a lot of US tribes have largely declined participating in research, which is why we see such a low rates of participation in GWAS studies today. But this type of action of recruiting urban individuals still persists today. Here are a couple of articles that were published last year in which, you know, there are still questions about whether or not All of Us is actually properly pursuing tribal engagement on the terms of tribal leaders, or whether or not they're just targeting large cities such as Phoenix for their recruitment. And that number 1,600 is something that's contested. It's probably more like 10,000 now, individuals that now in All of Us. And this is just an ongoing situation, but this is something that we as Indigenous researchers are really cognizant of and try to keep track of. It's particularly because there's this sort of a dichotomy between like, how do we engage and consult and get consents from individuals at the same time, you know, trying to get group levels of consent, because in this country and in the Western paradigm, it's individual level consent that is really dominant. Whereas other communities, you know, for them, it's more culturally consistent to seek more communal forms of consent. And yet here we see again that, you know, there have been just efforts to just completely ignore communal consent, which is more consistent with how we govern ourselves traditionally. And this is really of concern because, you know, it really doesn't take that much genetic data from an identified group to create a technology or a platform that has some real biocommercial potential here. If you look at, you know, the profit, you know, that Ancestry DNA has posted in the last couple of holiday seasons, to profits to the tune of over $1 billion in a quarter of a year. I mean, the biocommercial, the potential for biocommercial exploitation is real here. And here we see just more and more examples in which Indigenous markers are still being collected either from individuals within the Indigenous individuals of the US or global Indigenous individuals outside of the US who have less protections and who don't have federally recognized sovereignty in the same way that we do here in the States. So this is a real ongoing problem, is how can tribes govern for themselves the data that's being generated and collected from their people? So I really want to take the last couple minutes just to talk about a biobank that I and a few other Indigenous researchers have started in Eagle Butte, South Dakota. We call ourselves the Native Biodata Consortium, but we're really the first Indigenous-led biological data repository that's totally housed within the jurisdiction of a U.S. tribe. Our board members are tribal members from the Lakota Nations nearby, and we also are governed by a community advisory group of Lakota community members. Also, we have our board advisors include scientific and clinical advisors who are non-Indigenous, and also Indigenous legal advisors. And we are a 501c3 nonprofit, so we can operate and conduct research on our terms, and we can also like expand the amount of educational opportunities for community members who are living in the area. And there's just so many opportunities that we can do for ourselves, even if we are not a formal 4-year academic institution. So this is where we are located, right smack dab in the middle of South Dakota. And just again, for reference, you know, my lab is up in North Dakota, and I'm currently down here in Phoenix, Arizona. So quite a lot of travel, maybe not right now in today's climate, but it makes for some interesting airline mileage. You know, it took us 5+ years to establish these relationships with all of our different institutions. We do work with Stanford, for instance, and also an Indigenous-led for-profit organization within the community. Here are just an image of half of our community members that we try to compensate for their time, and they're really important. We keep them to the level, their level of expertise to the level of the PhD trained researchers that we work with, just because they're so important. And really just want to stress the importance of having these samples and data housed on tribal lands, so that we don't have to necessarily rely on dbGaP or other federally funded repositories to bank our own data. And that's one way to really bridge this disparity in lack of engagement of Indigenous peoples in genomics. So thank you, I'm done.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Krystal. We do have one question from an anonymous attendee, which is, how would you recommend that non-Indigenous researchers approach genetics research involving multiple tribal communities? Can and should non-Indigenous researchers do this research? And how should communication be coordinated across communities and tribal IRBs?
Yeah, so that's a really great question. I mean, obviously there's no blueprint because every single tribe works differently. Hopefully there's a tribal research regulatory board in place. Also know that RRBs are far more extensive in their level of protections than IRBs. So even if you wanted to do just the survey and not necessarily collect biological samples, you're still going to have to go through various levels of research. And that's good time, it takes time, it takes respect, you know, don't go into a community with a grant already in hand and state, oh, we have money to perform this research question that has absolutely no interest for you. And really the major thing is to just ask people. There's now an established network of researchers who are Indigenous, who are not Indigenous, people that are familiar with communities that will be able to guide you. And of course, there's that great paper that I linked earlier.
Awesome, thank you so much. And we're at time now, so I'm gonna ask you to stop sharing your screen. This kind of concludes our session on diversity, equity, inclusion. I wanna thank all of the speakers for a set of really inspiring and powerful talks. Thank you all for being here. And again, I also wanna thank GSA again for elevating these conversations and giving us an opportunity to have the first ever platform session on diversity, equity, inclusion. Thank you all attendees for participating today, and enjoy the rest of TAGC 2020 online. Thank you.
It was nice hearing you all talk. Thank you, Nadia, for everything.
Great job. I hope no one can hear us anymore, but a great job, everyone. It was awesome. This like exceeded all possible expectations. So thank you.
Thank you all. Stay safe,
Thanks,
everyone.
Nadia.
Thank you all.
Yeah. Great. Have a good rest of your conference.
Thank
Bye,
you.
everyone.
Bye.